Yorkshire, England, April 25th, 1945. The BBC broadcast crackled through the day room at Camp 83 Eden Camp at precisely 6 o'clock p.m. The sound cutting through air thick with cigarette smoke and the particular tension that comes from waiting for news you don't want to hear. The announcer's voice was measured, professional, carrying the weight of history without melodrama. Soviet forces have entered Berlin. Street fighting reported in the government quarter. The Reich Chancellery is under direct assault. Every man in the room stopped breathing. Hauptmann Ernst Weber stood with his back against the wall, watching 40 German prisoners freeze in place. Chess pieces abandoned mid-move, letters home left unfinished, conversations dying mid-sentence. They knew this was coming. Everyone knew. But knowing something intellectually and hearing it confirmed are different frequencies entirely. What they didn't know was how this moment would crack them open, how facing the end of everything they had believed in would force them to confront what they had been, and how one British Guard's small act of mercy would become the thing they remembered most about the day their world died. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who keeps history alive, so do me one favour, tap like so this story isn't buried, show support by subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video so more people discover the truth history tried to hide. The journey to this moment had begun 9 months earlier on a beach in Normandy. Weber had been a company commander in the 352nd Infantry Division, positioned at Omaha Beach. He was 34 years old, career military, son of a Great War veteran who had taught him that duty and honour were the same thing. He had believed this absolutely. Through Poland, through France in 1940, through the grinding horror of the Eastern Front, he had maintained faith that serving Germany meant serving something good, something worth the sacrifice. Normandy had shattered that faith like artillery fire shatters stone, not all at once, but in pieces, in moments that accumulated like water filling a cracked vessel. The morning of June 6th, watching thousands of ships materialize from the fog, realizing that everything they had been told about Allied weakness was a lie, seeing his men, boys, most of them, 18 and 19 years old, cut down by naval guns before they could even fire their weapons. Watching the defensive positions he'd been promised were impregnable dissolve under bombardment that seemed to have no end. He had fought for 3 days. Professional, efficient, doing what he was trained to do. But something had broken inside him. Some connection between action and meaning. He found himself executing orders without believing in them, fighting because stopping would mean death, not because victory seemed possible or even desirable. On June the 9th, his position was overrun. British infantry, moving fast, professional. He had expected execution. Instead, they gave him water and a cigarette. Asked his rank, disarmed him carefully, sent him to the rear with other prisoners. The courtesy had been more disorienting than cruelty would have been. The holding camps in France were temporary, chaotic. Thousands of prisoners, inadequate facilities, everyone waiting to be processed, shipped somewhere more permanent. Weber kept to himself, observed, tried to understand what had just happened to his life. Around him, officers argued about the war. Some insisted Germany would still win, that secret weapons were coming, that the Führer had plans that would turn everything around. Others were silent, processing the same broken faith Weber felt, but not yet ready to speak it aloud. The ship to England was crowded, dark, the crossing rough enough that many men were sick. Weber stood on deck when allowed, watching the French coast disappear, understanding he was leaving behind not just occupied territory, but any remnant of the world he had known. England emerged from the fog like something from a storybook. Green hills, stone walls, villages that looked ancient and untouched. Nothing like the bombed-out moonscapes of the Eastern Front or the devastated French countryside. This place had been at war for 5 years, but looked almost peaceful. The truck convoy travelled north through landscapes Weber had never imagined. Rolling farmland, sheep dotting hillsides, pubs with names like the King's Arms and the Rose and Crown. British soldiers driving the trucks were quiet but not hostile. One shared his rations when Weber looked particularly hungry. Small mercies that didn't fit the propaganda about English brutality. Camp 83 emerged from Yorkshire moorland like something both temporary and permanent. Rows of Nissen huts, curved metal structures that looked like half-buried pipes, arranged in neat rows, wire fences that seemed almost decorative. Guard towers manned by soldiers who looked bored rather than vigilant. The camp commandant was a lieutenant colonel named Pemberton, a man in his 50s, who had clearly spent the First War in trenches and wanted nothing more than for this Second War to end quietly. He addressed the new arrivals in careful German, translated by a younger officer. "You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated fairly. You will work. You will be fed. You will follow camp rules. Any questions will be addressed through proper channels." His tone suggested he had given this speech 100 times and expected it to require no follow-up. Weber appreciated the efficiency. No threats, no grand statements about Allied superiority. Just basic facts delivered by a man who wanted to get through his duty and go home. The Nissen huts were curved, cold but dry. Bunks with thin mattresses. Lockers for possessions prisoners didn't have. A stove in the centre that would matter come winter. Basic, functional, adequate. Better than field conditions. Better than many places Weber had slept during 5 years of war. The first meal was the first real surprise. Not abundant, this was wartime Britain after all, but real food. Bread, soup with actual vegetables and meat, tea with sugar. Not starvation rations, not the watery gruel he had expected. Weber ate slowly, tasting each bite, trying to reconcile enemy generosity with years of being told the British were cruel oppressors. Work assignments came quickly. Some men to farms, helping British agriculture cope with labour shortages. Others to road repair, forestry, maintenance. The labour was real, but not crushing. 8-hour days, breaks, guards who supervised without brutality. Weber was assigned to the camp workshop, repairing furniture and equipment. He had some carpentry skills from childhood, working with his grandfather. The British had discovered this during intake interviews and decided to use it. The efficiency was very British. Waste nothing. Use everyone's skills. Maintain order through productive routine. The workshop supervisor was a Yorkshire sergeant named Thomas Hawthorne, a man with hands scarred from a lifetime of woodworking and eyes that had seen too much in the Great War. He watched Weber work for 2 days before speaking beyond basic instructions. "Your officer class," Hawthorne said. Statement, not question. "I was. Still are. Just imprisoned. Germans are particular about rank." "Does it matter here?" Hawthorne shrugged. "Matters to some. Your lot organise yourselves by rank even in captivity. British would too, probably. People need structure, especially when everything else is chaos." They worked in silence after that, but it was companionable. The silence of 2 men who understood that some things didn't need saying. In the evenings, prisoners gathered in the day room. A large Nissen hut with tables, chairs, a radio positioned prominently. The BBC played constantly. News broadcasts, music programmes, cultural content. It was psychological warfare disguised as entertainment, and everyone knew it. The news was relentless. Allied advances across France, cities liberated, German forces in retreat, Soviet offensives in the east, pushing toward Germany itself. Each broadcast detailed another step toward inevitable defeat. Reactions among the prisoners varied. Some refused to listen, sat in corners playing cards, pretending the radio wasn't there. Others listened with stone faces, processing information that contradicted years of propaganda. A few, like Weber, listened analytically, trying to understand not just what was happening, but what it meant. He began to notice patterns in how different men responded. The younger soldiers, conscripts who had been drafted into a war they never chose, seemed almost relieved. Defeat meant the war would end. They could go home, rebuild lives. The career officers, like himself, were more complicated. They had invested everything in the military, in Germany's greatness, in the idea that their service meant something noble. One officer, Major Heinrich Voss, a panzer commander from Prussia, remained absolutely convinced Germany would win. "Secret weapons," he said whenever anyone expressed doubt. "The Führer has plans, new technology. We will turn this around." Weber watched Voss cling to this belief with something like pity. He understood the need for it. Accepting defeat meant accepting that everything, the death, the sacrifice, the years of service, had been for nothing. That was harder than believing in impossible victory. Another man, Lieutenant Paul Schneider, a schoolteacher from Munich conscripted in 1943, had reached different conclusions. "We're losing because we deserve to lose," he said quietly one evening. "You don't start a war against the entire world and expect to win. That's not strategy. That's insanity." "Careful," Voss warned. "Defeatism is still defeatism, even here." "We're already defeated," Schneider replied. "The only question is, how long until we admit it?" Weber said nothing, but he felt the truth of Schneider's words. They were already defeated, not just militarily, but spiritually. The cause they had served was broken. The question was what you did with that realization. The British had established mandatory educational sessions, films, lectures, discussions about democracy, about fascism, about what Germany had become. The stated purpose was re-education. The unstated purpose was denazification, forcing prisoners to confront the reality of the regime they had served. The first film was footage from concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, recently liberated by British forces. Bodies stacked like cordwood, survivors who looked like walking skeletons, children with eyes that had forgotten how to be children. The room erupted. Men shouting that it was fake, Allied propaganda, staged with actors and makeup. Weber sat silent, watching the footage, looking for evidence of manipulation. He wanted to believe it was fake, wanted desperately to believe his country couldn't have done this. But the evidence was overwhelming. German signs in backgrounds, SS guards in uniform, the geography of camps located in Germany itself, the sheer scale. You couldn't fake thousands of bodies, tens of thousands of survivors. The logistics alone would be impossible. "It's real," he said quietly. Voss turned on him. "You believe enemy propaganda. I believe evidence. This is documented reality." "Documented lies." "Then explain the bodies. Explain the survivors. Explain the German signs, the SS uniforms, the camp structures built on German soil." Weber's voice was steady, almost gentle. "I don't want to believe it, but wanting something doesn't make it false." The argument continued for hours. Most men fell somewhere between denial and acceptance, their minds trying to process information that shattered everything they thought they knew. A few, like Weber and Schneider, faced it directly. Others, like Voss, retreated deeper into denial. That night, Weber lay in his bunk and thought about choices, about the orders he had followed, the questions he hadn't asked, the convenient blindness that let him serve without examining what he was serving. He had never participated in atrocities, had never even seen the camps, but he had known something was wrong, had heard whispers, noticed things, chosen not to investigate. That choice, that deliberate not knowing, felt now like the worst crime of all. The months passed. Summer faded to autumn, autumn to winter. The war ground on, Germany shrinking under pressure from east and west. The BBC broadcast each new defeat, cities lost, territory liberated, allies crossing into Germany itself. Weber worked in the workshop, listened to broadcasts, talked with Schneider and a few others who were willing to face reality. They formed a small group, Not quite friends, but fellow travellers on the road from denial to acceptance. Hawthorne, the British sergeant, watched this transformation with something like approval. One day, working on repairing a table, he spoke casually. "You're different than when you arrived." "How so?" "Lighter, maybe. Like you put down something heavy." Weber considered this. "Easier to carry truth than lies. Lies require constant effort to maintain. Truth just sits there, whether you like it or not." Philosophy from a carpenter. Carpentry from a philosopher, maybe. Weber smiled slightly. "Before the war, I thought about becoming a teacher. Then my father convinced me the military was more honourable. Now I wonder what I would have taught." "Teach it now," Hawthorne suggested. "Here, in the camp. Some of your lot are still carrying those lies. Heavy burden. Maybe you could help them put it down." The idea took root. Weber began organising informal discussions in the evenings, not lectures. He had no authority for that. Just conversations. About what they had seen, what the evidence showed, what it meant for Germany's future. Not everyone came. Voss and his loyalists avoided these sessions, called them collaboration, treason, but others attended. Young soldiers trying to understand what they had been part of. Officers like Weber who needed to process their complicity. Even some older men who had survived the Great War and recognized patterns repeating. Schneider became co-facilitator. His teaching background made him good at asking questions, drawing out thoughts, helping men articulate what they were feeling. Together, they created space for transformation, not forcing it, just allowing it. By April 1945, about 20 prisoners regularly attended these sessions. They called it the discussion group, careful to avoid any name that might sound like organised resistance. The British Guards tolerated it, even seemed to approve. Pemberton, the commandant, mentioned once that men thinking critically is never a bad thing. The BBC broadcasts in April became increasingly dramatic. Allied forces crossing the Rhine, Soviet armies encircling Berlin, Hamburg surrendering, Munich occupied. Each announcement marked another piece of Germany erased. Weber watched the map in his mind shrink. Soon there would be nothing left. Just rubble and memory and the hard work of rebuilding from complete destruction. On April 23rd, the BBC announced that Soviet forces had reached Berlin's outskirts, fighting in suburbs, the final battle beginning. Everyone knew what this meant. Berlin was the symbolic heart of the Reich. When Berlin fell, everything fell. For 2 days, the broadcasts provided updates. Street fighting, district by district occupation, German forces fighting desperately but uselessly, the end approaching like slow-motion avalanche, unstoppable, inevitable, crushing. April 25th was a Wednesday, a normal day, if any day could be normal in a prisoner of war camp, while your homeland was dying. Work details in the morning, lunch at noon, afternoon workshop hours. Weber repaired chairs, sanded table legs, kept his hands busy while his mind churned. At 5:30, work ended. Prisoners returned to barracks, washed, changed into their better uniforms for evening. At 6 o'clock, the day room filled. 40 men, maybe more. Conversations, card games, letter writing. The usual evening routine, and always the radio, always the BBC. At 6 o'clock precisely, the news programme began. Standard introduction, headlines from various fronts. Then the announcer's voice shifted, took on additional weight. Soviet forces have entered Berlin. Street fighting reported in the government quarter. The Reich Chancellery is under direct assault. The room went dead silent. Weber stood with his back against the wall, watching reactions. Some men's faces crumbled immediately. Others went blank, shut down. A few looked almost relieved, finally, the uncertainty ending. Voss sat rigid, fists clenched, jaw tight, refusing to accept what he was hearing. The announcer continued. Details about which Soviet armies were involved, descriptions of the fighting, mentions of Hitler's location, believed to be in his bunker beneath the Chancellery, maps of Berlin showing Soviet penetration, analysis of how long the city could hold. Not long, days maybe, possibly hours if resistance collapsed. Someone turned off the radio. The silence was absolute, suffocating. 40 men breathing, no one speaking. What was there to say? The thing they had all known was coming had arrived. Berlin was falling. Germany was dying. Everything was ending. Weber looked at the men around him and saw grief. Real, profound grief. Not for Hitler or the Reich, but for Germany itself. For homes they would return to find destroyed. For families they might never see again. For the country they had believed in, which had betrayed them so thoroughly. Voss broke the silence. It's propaganda. Berlin will hold. The Führer will never surrender. No one responded. Even Voss's usual supporters stayed quiet. The denial was too thin now, unable to cover the reality showing through. Weber pushed off from the wall. He didn't plan what he said next. It simply emerged, born from months of processing, discussing, accepting. Berlin is falling, he said quietly. Germany has lost the war. We all knew this was coming. Now it's here. And we have to decide who we're going to be in what comes next. Traitor, Voss spat. No. I'm just the first one willing to say aloud what everyone in this room already knows. The war is over. We lost. Not because of betrayal or weakness, but because we started a war we couldn't win, in service of a regime that didn't deserve our loyalty. You dare? I dare, because silence is its own betrayal. Silence is how we got here, how we allowed things to happen that should never have happened, how we served evil while telling ourselves we were serving Germany. The room remained silent, but men were listening, really listening. Schneider stood up, joined Weber. He's right. We all know it. Berlin is falling. When it falls, Hitler will be dead or captured. The Reich will cease to exist. And we'll have to live with what we did, what we allowed, what we failed to prevent. The camps, Weber continued. The deportations, the murders. We knew something was wrong. Maybe we didn't know everything, but we knew enough. And we chose not to look, not to ask, not to resist. What could we have done? Someone asked. Young voice, uncertain. I don't know, Weber admitted. Maybe nothing. Maybe we would have been killed for resisting. But we could have tried. We could have asked questions. We could have refused to be comfortable while others suffered. Voss stood, furious. I will not listen to this defeatist collaboration. He stormed toward the door. Running won't change the truth, Weber called after him. Berlin is still falling, whether you acknowledge it or not. Voss left, slamming the door. A few others followed, but most stayed. Stayed and sat with the silence and the grief and the terrible weight of knowing their world was ending. After a long moment, Hawthorne appeared in the doorway. The British sergeant who supervised the workshop, who had watched Weber's transformation over months. He held something in his hands. A bottle of whiskey, British military issue, probably from the guards' mess. Thought you lot might need this, he said quietly, in heavily accented German. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not sorry you're losing, that needed to happen. But sorry for what it means for you, for your families, for everything you'll return to. He set the bottle on the table, then left as quickly as he'd come. A small gesture, probably unauthorized, definitely kind. Weber stared at the bottle. This moment, this small act of compassion from an enemy, felt more important than any battle, any speech, any grand historical event. This was one human seeing another's pain and offering the only comfort he could. Schneider opened the bottle, poured small amounts into cups, passed them around. 20 men, sharing British whiskey while their capital fell. The absurdity wasn't lost on anyone. What do we do now? Someone asked. We wait, Weber said. Wait for Berlin to fall. Wait for the war to end. Wait to go home to whatever remains. And then? Then we rebuild. Not the same Germany. Something better. Something that can look at what we did and say, "Never again," and mean it. You think that's possible? I think it has to be, because the alternative is repeating this. And I can't bear the thought of my children fighting another war like this one. Can't bear the thought of another generation learning to kill efficiently while failing to think critically. They sat in silence, sipping whiskey, listening to the quiet. Outside, Yorkshire evening was falling, gentle and peaceful. Inside, 40 men were mourning the death of everything they had known. Over the following days, the BBC provided constant updates. Berlin's final agony, Hitler's suicide, the unconditional surrender, the absolute end. Each announcement was met with that same crushing silence. Voss stopped coming to the day room, stopped attending work details, sat in his bunk, facing the wall, speaking to no one. The British Guards let him be. They had seen this before, men who couldn't integrate defeat into their understanding of reality, who simply shut down. Others began tentative conversations about the future. What would Germany look like under occupation? How would they rebuild cities? How would they feed millions of displaced people? Practical questions that required facing forward rather than backward. Weber's discussion group continued, now openly called Facing Reality Sessions, with Pemberton's explicit approval. They discussed what they had learned, what they would teach their children, how they would build something new from the ruins. On May 8th, the BBC broadcast the announcement of VE Day, Victory in Europe, Complete German Surrender. The war on this continent was finally, definitively over. In Camp 83, the British Guards celebrated quietly, not with triumphalism, they had lost too many friends for that, but with relief. It was over. They could go home. The killing was done. For the German prisoners, VE Day was complicated. Relief that the war was over. Horror at what they were returning to. Uncertainty about what came next. Grief for everything lost. That evening, the British brought extra rations, better food, real beer, even some chocolate. Another small kindness from guards who understood that victory and defeat were two sides of the same terrible coin. Hawthorne found Weber in the workshop, where he had gone to be alone with his thoughts. "Your family?" Hawthorne asked quietly. "Dresden, or they were. The city was firebombed in February. I don't know if they survived." "I'm sorry." "Are you? We bombed London, Coventry, Rotterdam. The circle of violence has to start somewhere. Doesn't mean I'm not sorry about Dresden, about your family. War makes us all complicit in things we'd never choose individually." They sat in silence. Two carpenters from different sides of a war, finding common ground in wood shavings and shared humanity. "What happens now?" Weber asked. "To us?" "Repatriation eventually. Might be months, might be longer. Depends on conditions in Germany. Can't send you back until there's something to send you back to." "And when we go back, what then?" Hawthorne shrugged. "You rebuild, same as Britain did after the Blitz, same as France is doing now. You put one stone on another day after day until something new stands where the old thing fell. And if people don't want to change, if they want to resurrect what was, then you teach them different. You and Schneider and the others who figured it out. You become teachers, like you should have been before the war. You raise children who ask questions instead of following orders. You build a Germany that remembers so clearly it never forgets." It sounded impossible, but so had surviving the war, so had facing the truth about what Germany had done. Impossible things happened all the time. Repatriation began in late 1945. Slow process, chaotic. Transportation was limited. Germany was divided into occupation zones. Everything had to be organized through military bureaucracy. Weber was among the later groups. Officers were being held longer for additional screening, denazification processing. He used the time to prepare, wrote letters to addresses that might not exist anymore, read everything the British provided about the occupation, about reconstruction plans, about the new Germany taking shape. Attended every educational session offered, Schneider was repatriated in November. He gripped Weber's hand in farewell. "See you in the new Germany, the one we build together. The one where we teach instead of fight." Exactly that. Voss was sent back in December, still rigid, still denying. Weber wondered what would become of him, this man who couldn't adapt to truth. Probably he would find others like himself, huddled together in shared delusion. Or possibly reality would break through eventually. Either way, it wasn't Weber's responsibility. January 1946 brought Weber's turn. The journey back was long, complicated. Train across England to a port, ship across the Channel, truck convoy through occupied France into the British zone of Germany. Every mile closer, every kilometre of destroyed landscape, drove home the completeness of defeat. His hometown was rubble, simply rubble. The beautiful medieval centre where he had grown up was gone. The house where he was born didn't exist. His street was a crater. He found his sister living in a displaced persons camp on the edge of town. His parents were dead, killed in the firebombing. His younger brother missing, probably dead on the Eastern Front. But his sister had survived, and her children, and that was something. They didn't speak for a long time, just held each other and cried for everything lost. "I heard you were a prisoner in England," she said finally. "I was, for 10 months. What was it like?" He thought about how to answer, about the food and the work and the endless BBC broadcasts, about the discussion group and facing truth and whiskey shared on the night Berlin fell, about Hawthorne's kindness and Pemberton's quiet efficiency and the strange mercy of being treated well by enemies. "It was the place where I learned to see clearly," he said, "where I stopped lying to myself about what we had been, what we had done, what we needed to become instead." She nodded. "We need more people who can see clearly. Too many still don't. Still believe the lies, still think we were the victims. Then we teach them, patiently, persistently, one person at a time." Over the following years, Weber became that teacher he should have been. Worked in schools, taught history and critical thinking and the importance of questioning authority. Taught children to examine evidence, to resist propaganda, to understand that following orders was never an excuse for cruelty. Schneider did the same in Munich. They corresponded regularly, sharing techniques, supporting each other through the hard work of denazification from the ground up. Not the formal process imposed by the Allies, but the deeper process of changing hearts and minds. In 1952, Weber received a letter from England, from Hawthorne, the workshop sergeant. They had exchanged a few letters over the years, updates on life, the slow process of rebuilding. This letter was different. Hawthorne was dying, cancer, inoperable. He wanted to say goodbye, but also to tell Weber something he'd never mentioned before. "That night when Berlin was falling," Hawthorne wrote, "I brought you that whiskey without permission. Got reprimanded for it later, in fact. But I'd do it again, because I saw 40 men facing the end of their world, and I remembered feeling that way myself in 1918. Remembered what it was like when everything you believed in crumbled, and I thought, if I could do one small thing to show that kindness survives, even when everything else fails, maybe that would matter. Maybe that would be a signal that the future could be different than the past." Weber read that letter 17 times, held it like the most fragile and important thing he had ever touched. He wrote back immediately, telling Hawthorne that the gesture had mattered more than any formal education, any mandatory screening, any denazification process. That one act of unexpected compassion had proven that humans could choose mercy even when surrounded by reasons for revenge. That small kindness had been more transformative than any punishment could have been. Hawthorne died before receiving the letter. But Weber kept writing to Hawthorne's widow, maintaining the connection. Eventually, in 1956, he visited England, travelled to Yorkshire, stood in the workshop where he had learned to see clearly. Camp 83 was abandoned by then, the Nissen huts empty, the wire fences rusting. But the bones of it remained. the place where 40 men had heard their world ending and learned to imagine something better. In the decades after, historians would debate the effectiveness of Britain's POW programs. Some argued that kindness made prisoners soft, that harsher treatment would have been more effective at denazification. Others pointed to evidence that treating prisoners humanely made them more receptive to change, more willing to examine their beliefs. Weber never engaged in these debates. He simply knew what had worked for him. Not lectures or films or formal education, though those helped, but small moments of connection. Hawthorne's quiet approval of his transformation, Pemberton's permission to hold discussion groups, that bottle of whiskey on the night Berlin fell. Those moments of humanity from enemies had done what punishment never could. They had shown him that people could choose differently, that the cycle of violence could be interrupted, that mercy was possible even between enemies. He taught this to his students, not as abstract principle, but as lived experience. He told them about the night the BBC announced Berlin was falling, about the crushing silence in that room, about the British sergeant who brought whiskey and apology and recognition of shared humanity. That's how you break the cycle, he told them. Not with more violence, more vengeance, more cruelty, but with small acts of mercy that prove something better is possible, with kindness extended even to enemies, with seeing the humanity in everyone, even those who have done terrible things. Some students understood immediately. Others took longer. A few never got it. The pull of nationalism, of seeing the world in terms of us and them, was strong. But most eventually grasped what he was teaching. That transformation from bitterness to mercy, from denial to truth, from violence to peace, that was the real victory of the war. Not military triumph, but the slow work of changing hearts. Weber died in 1982 in a Germany so different from the one he'd served that it might as well have been another planet, democratic, prosperous, peaceful. His students scattered across the country, many of them teachers themselves now, spreading the same lessons he had taught. At his funeral, someone read from his diary, entries from April 1945, from those days when Berlin fell and the world ended and whiskey tasted like hope. One entry in particular resonated. Tonight I learned that enemies can be kind, that defeat can be mercy, that losing everything you believed in can be the first step toward finding something worth believing in. The British didn't defeat me with cruelty or punishment. They defeated me with decency, with showing me that people who had every reason to hate could still choose compassion. That small gesture, one bottle of whiskey shared in grief, did more to change my heart than any weapon ever could. That's what I'll remember. Not the fall of Berlin, not the end of the Reich, but the moment a British sergeant saw our pain and offered comfort. That's what I'll teach. That's what matters. The barracks at Eden Camp still stand, preserved as a museum now. Visitors can walk through the Nissen huts, see the bunks where prisoners slept, read displays about daily life in POW camps. There's a section about the discussion groups, about prisoners like Weber who faced truth and helped others do the same. And there's a small exhibit about April 25th, 1945, about the night the BBC announced Berlin was falling, about 40 men sitting in silence facing the end, about a British sergeant who brought whiskey and mercy when mercy seemed impossible. The exhibit includes a photograph of Hawthorne, standing in his workshop, tools in hand. Next to it, a letter from Weber, thanking him for that gesture, explaining how it changed everything. Visitors read these things and understand something essential, that the most important moments in history aren't always the battles or the treaties or the grand political statements. Sometimes they're smaller, more intimate, more human. Sometimes the moment that changes everything is the one where an enemy sees your grief and responds with kindness, where someone in power chooses mercy over vengeance, where a simple gesture proves that humanity survives even in the darkest times. The room went silent when Berlin fell. But from that silence came voices. Voices committed to truth, to teaching, to building something better. Voices that said, "We will not forget what happened. We will not pretend it was justified. We will face it fully so we never repeat it." Those voices echo still, in classrooms across Germany, in museums dedicated to remembering clearly, in the simple commitment of each generation to teach the next one differently, better, more honestly. That's the legacy of April 25th, 1945, not the fall of Berlin, but what came after, not the end of one world, but the beginning of another, not the silence itself, but what emerged from the silence when people chose truth over comfort, mercy over revenge, teaching over forgetting. The barracks are empty now. The prisoners long since returned home, most of them dead. The guards retired, their war finished. But the lesson remains. Written in museum exhibits and history books, and the memories of students who learned from teachers, who learned from prisoners, who learned from enemies who chose kindness. One bottle of whiskey, one moment of mercy. One choice to respond to grief with compassion rather than triumph. That's all it took to prove that even in the darkest moment, even when everything is ending, humanity persists. The room went silent when Berlin fell. But from that silence, something new was born. Something better. Something that remembered clearly enough to never forget. That's what matters. That's what survives. Not the fall, but the rebuilding. Not the end, but the beginning. Not the silence, but the voices that rose from it saying, "We were wrong. We will change. We will teach our children differently. We will build a world where mercy defeats cruelty, where truth overcomes lies, where even enemies can become teachers." That world exists now, imperfect but real. Built by people like Weber and Schneider, and thousands of others who learned to see clearly and chose to teach that clarity forward. Built on small moments of mercy from people like Hawthorne, who proved that compassion survives even when everything else fails. The room went silent. Then it spoke. And the words it spoke changed everything.